In 1588, the largest invasion fleet the world had ever seen was bearing down on England. 130 Spanish warships carrying 8,000 sailors and 20,000 soldiers were sailing up the English Channel with a single mission: overthrow Queen Elizabeth, restore Catholic rule, and end England as a Protestant nation forever. But the man the Queen had chosen to help stop them was not some decorated nobleman born into power. He was the son of a tenant farmer from Devon who had clawed his way up from nothing, robbed the Spanish Empire blind on 3 separate oceans, sailed around the entire planet, and terrified King Philip II so badly that the Spanish had given him a nickname, El Drac, the Dragon. His real name was Francis Drake, and this is the story of how a commoner became the most dangerous pirate on earth, how a queen used him as a weapon, and how together they broke the spine of the most dominant empire in the world. To understand how Francis Drake became the man who would help save England, you have to go back to where he came from. And where he came from was about as far from glory as you could get. Drake was born around 1540 in Tavistock, a small town in Devon, in the southwest of England. His father, Edmund, was a Protestant farmer and lay preacher on Lord Francis Russell's estate. And in the England of the 1540s, being a vocal Protestant was not a safe career choice. When a Catholic uprising swept through Devon in 1549, the Drake family was forced to flee. They ended up in Kent, and for a while they lived in the hull of an old ship moored on the River Medway near Chatham. That is how poor they were. A rotting boat was their home, but the water got into Drake's blood early. As a boy, he was apprenticed to the captain of a small coastal trading vessel that ran cargo through the English Channel and across to the Netherlands. He learned to read tides, handle rigging, and navigate by the stars in some of the most treacherous waters in Europe. By the time he was a teenager, he was already a competent sailor, and when the old captain died, he left the entire ship to Drake. That should tell you something about the kind of young man he was. He earned trust fast. Through family connections, Drake found his way into the orbit of John Hawkins, one of England's most prominent naval commanders and a relative of Drake's on his mother's side. Hawkins was running a very specific kind of business. He was capturing Africans on the West African coast and selling them as slaves to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. It was illegal under Spanish law, but profitable enough that Hawkins did not care. Drake sailed with Hawkins on these expeditions, and by 1568, at around 28 years old, he had command of his own ship, the Judith. That year, everything changed. Drake and Hawkins sailed to the Mexican port of San Juan de Ulua to trade their captives to Spanish settlers. They arrived thinking they had a deal. They anchored their ships in the harbor, expecting business as usual. But a large Spanish fleet arrived shortly after, and what began as a tense standoff turned into a full-blown ambush. The Spanish opened fire without warning. English ships were boarded, burned, and sunk. Men were cut down on the decks and in the water. Out of the entire English fleet, only 2 vessels escaped: Drake's Judith and Hawkins's ship. Everyone else was either killed or captured. Some of those captured would later face the Spanish Inquisition. That ambush lit a fire in Francis Drake that never went out. From that day forward, he carried a deep personal hatred of the Spanish crown, and he would spend the rest of his life making King Philip pay for it. But Drake was not reckless about his revenge. He was strategic. He spent the next few years making reconnaissance voyages to the Caribbean, studying Spanish shipping routes, mapping harbors, and identifying the weak points in Spain's colonial defenses. He was not just a pirate looking for a quick score. He was building an operational plan, and in 1572, he was ready to execute it. Queen Elizabeth gave Drake a privateer's commission, which was essentially a legal license to rob Spanish ships and settlements on behalf of the English crown. Drake sailed for the Isthmus of Panama with 2 small ships and launched a raid on the port of Nombre de Dios. This was a small town, but it was strategically critical because the Spanish used it as a transfer point. Silver and gold mined in Peru would travel across the Pacific on treasure ships, get unloaded in Panama, carried overland by mule train across the isthmus, and then loaded onto galleons waiting in the Caribbean for the voyage back to Spain. Drake hit the mule trains. He was badly wounded during the initial assault on the port and had to recover before pressing on. But once he was back on his feet, he and his men, aided by Cimarrons, escaped African slaves who knew the jungle trails and hated the Spanish as much as Drake did, ambushed a treasure caravan, and made off with a fortune in silver and gold. Drake sailed back to Plymouth in 1573 with his ships loaded down with Spanish loot. Word of this raid reached the court of Queen Elizabeth, and the Queen was very interested. England was a small, relatively poor Protestant nation at this point, constantly looking over its shoulder at Catholic Spain, the superpower of the age. Spain controlled vast territories in the Americas, had a seemingly endless supply of gold and silver flowing in from Peru and Mexico, and had the most powerful navy afloat. Elizabeth could not openly challenge Philip without risking a war she might lose, but she could quietly send men like Drake to bleed the Spanish treasury and disrupt their colonial operations. Drake was now one of Elizabeth's sea dogs, a loose network of privateer captains who did the Queen's dirty work on the open ocean while giving her plausible deniability. And in 1577, Elizabeth gave Drake the biggest assignment of his life. She invested her own money into an expedition and secretly instructed Drake to sail into the Pacific Ocean, raid Spanish colonial settlements along the coast of South America, and take whatever treasure he could find. On paper, this was described as a voyage of discovery. In reality, it was a state-sponsored robbery spree on a global scale. Drake left Plymouth on December 13, 1577, with a fleet of 5 ships. The flagship was the Pelican, which Drake would later rename the Golden Hind. 164 men sailed with him. Most of them had no idea what they were actually getting into. The voyage started rough. Storms battered the fleet as they crossed the Atlantic. They captured some Spanish and Portuguese vessels along the way, but conditions were harsh. When the fleet reached Port St. Julian on the coast of Patagonia, Drake faced a crisis that could have ended the entire expedition. Thomas Doughty, one of Drake's officers and a well-connected gentleman, was accused of inciting mutiny. Drake put him on trial, found him guilty, and had him executed on the spot. It was the same harbor where Ferdinand Magellan had dealt with his own mutineers nearly 60 years earlier. After the execution, Drake gave a famous speech to his remaining crew. Sailors and gentlemen would work together as equals from that point forward. Everyone answered to Drake, and Drake alone. That moment changed the expedition. From then on, there was no question about who was in charge. Drake pushed the fleet into the Straits of Magellan, the narrow, violent passage at the southern tip of South America that connects the Atlantic to the Pacific. The strait is about 350 miles long, flanked by jagged cliffs and hit by some of the worst weather on Earth. Freezing winds rip through the channel, currents are unpredictable. Visibility drops to almost nothing in fog and driving rain. Magellan himself had taken 38 days to navigate it. Drake made the crossing in just 16, a feat of seamanship that still impresses historians. But the Pacific did not greet him kindly. Almost immediately after clearing the strait, massive storms slammed into the fleet and raged for weeks. The Marigold was swallowed by the sea with all hands. The Elizabeth, under Captain John Winter, turned back to England. One of the smaller ships had already been scuttled earlier in the voyage. By the time Drake reached open water in October of 1578, only the Golden Hind was left. One ship, one crew, thousands of miles from home, in waters no English vessel had ever sailed. But here is where Drake's genius showed. The Spanish had no idea he was there. For decades, Spain had treated the Pacific as its private ocean. There were no enemy ships, no rival navies, no threats at all. Spanish colonial ports along the coast of Chile and Peru were completely undefended. Treasure ships sailed without escort, and Drake fell on them like a wolf. He started at Valparaiso, Chile, where his crew looted the port and captured a ship loaded with wine and supplies. They raided town after town up the coast, stripping settlements of silver and gold, capturing vessels and cutting anchor cables in harbors so Spanish ships could not pursue them. Drake treated his prisoners well, fed them, gave them gifts, and then sent them off in ships he had stripped of their sails. It was a signature move. He was ruthless in what he took, but courteous in how he did it. Then Drake got word of the biggest prize of all. A Spanish treasure galleon called the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción was sailing north from Lima toward Panama, loaded with the riches of Peru. The Spanish sailors called the ship by a nickname that roughly translates to Spitfire. Drake chased her for days. When he finally spotted her off the coast of Ecuador on March 1st, 1579, the galleon was so overloaded with treasure that she could barely move. Drake dragged wine casks behind the Golden Hind to slow his own ship down so he would not close the distance too quickly and raise suspicion. He wanted to wait for nightfall. When darkness came, Drake pulled alongside and demanded the Spanish captain surrender. The captain refused. Drake opened fire. The first broadside ripped off the galleon's mizzenmast. English musket fire raked the deck. The fight was over in minutes. And what Drake found in that hold was staggering. 26 tons of silver bars, 80 pounds of gold, 13 chests of coins, thousands of pieces of jewelry and precious stones. The total value of the treasure, combined with everything else Drake had plundered along the voyage, came to roughly £600,000. That was more than double the entire annual revenue of the English crown. Queen Elizabeth's personal share alone was enough to pay off the national debt and still have £40,000 left over to invest in a new trading company. Investors who had put money into the voyage received £47 back for every single pound they had risked. That is a 4,700% return on investment. With the Golden Hind's hold bulging with stolen treasure, Drake could not sail back the way he came. Spanish warships were hunting for him all along the South American coast, so he did something no one expected. He sailed north, all the way up to present-day California, where he claimed the land for England and named it New Albion because the white coastal cliffs reminded him of the cliffs of Dover. He may have sailed even farther north, possibly as far as Vancouver or Alaska, looking for the fabled Northwest Passage that would have given him a shortcut back to the Atlantic. He did not find it. So Drake turned the Golden Hind west and committed to the most daring decision of the entire voyage. He would sail home by going around the world. The Pacific crossing took months. The crew navigated by the stars across thousands of miles of open ocean with no charts and no landmarks. They reached the Moluccas, the famed spice islands of modern Indonesia, where Drake loaded up on cloves and other valuable spices. They nearly lost the ship when the Golden Hind ran aground on a reef near the island of Celebes, and only managed to free her by throwing cargo overboard and waiting for the tide to shift. From there they sailed to Java, then across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, and finally up the west coast of the continent. Drake arrived back in Plymouth on September 26, 1580, nearly 3 years after he had left. When the Golden Hind sailed into Plymouth Harbour, most people in England had assumed Drake and his crew were dead. They had been gone so long that no one expected them to return. Drake reportedly hailed a fishing boat in the harbour and asked the astonished fishermen whether Queen Elizabeth was still alive. If a monarch friendly to Spain had taken the throne while he was gone, coming home with a ship full of stolen Spanish treasure would have been a death sentence. But Elizabeth was very much alive, and she was thrilled. 7 months later, on April 4, 1581, the Queen visited the Golden Hind at Deptford on the Thames. In a carefully staged ceremony, she knighted Drake right there on the deck of his ship. But in a clever political move, she had the French ambassador perform the actual knighting. That way, she could not be accused of personally rewarding a man whom Spain considered a pirate. The message to King Philip, though, was impossible to miss. England's queen was openly honoring the man who had robbed Spain's empire and sailed around the world doing it. The Spanish were furious. King Philip demanded Drake's arrest and the return of the stolen treasure. Elizabeth refused. Drake's circumnavigation became a sensation in England. The Golden Hind was put on public display at Deptford, and it sat there for nearly 70 years before it finally rotted away. A chair carved from its timbers still exists in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. Drake became one of the most famous men in England, and across the Spanish Empire, the name El Draque, was spoken with something close to dread. But the tension between England and Spain was building towards something much bigger. By the mid-1580s, open war was becoming inevitable. Elizabeth was supporting Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands. English privateers were attacking Spanish shipping almost constantly, and Philip had had enough. He began assembling a massive invasion fleet in the ports of Spain and Portugal. The plan was simple: sail the fleet up the English Channel, link up with a Spanish army in the Netherlands, ferry those troops across to England, and crush Elizabeth's kingdom. Elizabeth's spies knew it was coming, and in April of 1587, she authorized Drake to do something about it. Here is where things get interesting, though. After Drake sailed from Plymouth, Elizabeth had second thoughts and sent a messenger ship after him with orders to call off the attack. But the messenger ship was forced back to port by headwinds and never reached Drake. Some historians believe Elizabeth planned it that way. She wanted the attack to happen, but she also wanted the ability to claim she had tried to stop it. It was exactly the kind of political maneuvering that made the Queen so effective. Drake arrived at Cadiz on April 19th and launched a surprise attack directly into the harbour, one of Spain's most important naval ports. English boarding parties rowed out to anchored Spanish ships, set them ablaze, and looted everything they could carry. Over the course of several days, Drake and his men destroyed around 30 ships and burned enormous quantities of supplies, including thousands of barrel staves that were essential for storing food and water aboard the Armada's vessels. Drake boasted afterward that he had singed the King of Spain's beard. The raid delayed the Armada's launch by an entire year and forced the Spanish to rebuild with inferior materials. Some of the replacement barrels leaked, spoiling food and water before the fleet even reached the English Channel. But Philip pressed on. In May of 1588, the Spanish Armada finally set sail from Lisbon under the command of the Duke of Medina. Sidonia, 130 ships, 8,000 sailors, 20,000 soldiers. It was the largest naval force Europe had ever seen. Its mission was to pick up the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands and carry it across the Channel for a full-scale invasion of England. When the Armada was spotted off the English coast in late July, beacons were lit along the shoreline from Devon to London, alerting the nation that the invasion was underway. According to legend, Drake was playing a game of bowls on Plymouth Hoe, the grassy clifftop overlooking the harbour, when the news arrived. The story says he calmly replied that there was plenty of time to finish the game and still beat the Spaniards. Whether or not that actually happened, and historians still argue about it, the story captured something real about Drake. He was not a man who panicked. The English fleet sailed out to meet the Armada under the overall command of Lord Howard of Effingham, the Lord High Admiral. Drake served as Vice Admiral, Howard's second in command. Howard was a political appointee with little combat experience, but he was smart enough to lean on Drake and the other experienced sea captains under his command. The two fleets clashed in a series of running engagements as the Armada sailed up the Channel. The English ships were faster, lower in the water, and carried heavier cannons. The Spanish ships were bigger and designed for close-quarters boarding combat, a tactic the English refused to allow. Howard and Drake kept their distance, harassing the Armada with long-range cannon fire, but unable to break its tight crescent formation. Then came the moment that changed everything. On the night of July 27th, the Armada anchored off Calais to wait for the Duke of Parma's troops. But Parma was not ready. His barges were not in position, and the shallow Dutch ports he was using could not accommodate Medina Sidonia's deep-drafted warships. The Spanish fleet was sitting still, clustered together, waiting. At midnight, the English sent 8 fire ships drifting toward the anchored Armada. These were old vessels packed with pitch, gunpowder, and anything else that would burn, deliberately set ablaze and carried by wind and tide straight into the Spanish formation. Drake had used the same tactic at Cadiz the year before. The Spanish knew it was coming. Medina Sidonia had warned his captains. But knowing about fire ships and watching 8 burning hulks bear down on your fleet in the middle of the night are two very different things. Panic spread through the Armada. Captains cut their anchor cables and scattered into the open sea. The tight crescent formation that had protected them through the entire Channel passage was gone. The next morning, the English attacked. In what became known as the Battle of Gravelines, Howard and Drake closed to effective range for the first time and poured broadside after broadside into the disorganized Spanish ships. The fighting lasted 9 hours. The Spanish fought back with small arms and what cannon they could bring to bear, but their fleet was scattered and many of their guns could not match the range of the English artillery. By the end of the day, several Spanish ships had been sunk or captured, and the rest were being driven eastward toward the shallow sandbanks off the Dutch coast. A shift in the wind saved the Armada from total destruction on those banks, but the prevailing westerly winds made it impossible for the Spanish to sail back down the channel. They had no choice but to flee northward, around the top of Scotland, and then down the wild west coast of Ireland to get home. It was the longest possible route back to Spain, and the weather turned savage. Atlantic storms battered the retreating fleet for weeks. Ships that had already been damaged by English cannon fire began to break apart in the heavy seas. Dozens of vessels were wrecked on the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Thousands of Spanish sailors drowned or were killed by locals after washing ashore. Ships that had lost their anchors during the fireship panic at Calais could not safely shelter in any port. Men starved because the food barrels, hastily rebuilt after Drake's Cadiz raid destroyed the original staves, had leaked and spoiled the provisions. By the time the remnants of the Armada finally limped back into Spanish ports in the autumn of 1588, roughly 60 of the original 130 ships had been lost, along with an estimated 15,000 men. England celebrated. Drake was a national hero. Elizabeth delivered her famous speech at Tilbury, and Spain's reputation as an invincible superpower was shattered. But the story does not end with triumph. Drake's reputation, as untouchable as it seemed after the Armada, took a serious hit the very next year. In 1589, he was given command of the English Armada, a counter-expedition meant to finish off the weakened Spanish fleet, support Portuguese rebels in Lisbon, and seize the Azores. It was a disaster. The expedition lost around 20 ships and 12,000 men, and achieved almost none of its objectives. Drake returned to England in disgrace and spent the next 6 years out of favour, living quietly on his estate at Buckland Abbey in Devon. In 1595, Elizabeth gave Drake one last chance. She sent him and John Hawkins, his old mentor and cousin, on a joint expedition to the Caribbean to raid Spanish colonial ports. 27 ships and 2,500 men sailed under their command. It should have been a triumphant return to the waters where Drake had made his name. But Drake was in his mid-50s by then, and the world had changed. The old magic was gone. The Spanish were prepared this time, and the raids went badly from the start. Hawkins died aboard ship before they even reached Puerto Rico. Drake attacked San Juan, but was repulsed. A cannonball tore through the cabin of his flagship during the assault, narrowly missing him. The expedition pushed on to Panama, where Drake attempted to cross the isthmus and strike at the treasure routes he had raided so successfully 20 years earlier. But Spanish defenders turned the English forces back. Disease was ravaging the fleet, and then Drake himself fell ill. He contracted dysentery off the coast of Portobelo, Panama. As the sickness consumed him, Drake reportedly asked to be dressed in his full suit of armor. He died on January 28, 1596. He was around 56 years old. His crew placed his body in a lead-lined coffin and buried him at sea just off the coast of Portobelo. Divers and treasure hunters have searched for that coffin for centuries. It has never been found. Francis Drake was a man of contradictions. He was a devout Protestant who saw his war against Spain as a holy cause, and he was also a man who participated in the slave trade as a young sailor. He was generous to his prisoners and ruthless to his enemies. He was a commoner who dined with queens and a pirate who became a knight. But what is undeniable is the scale of what he accomplished. He sailed around the world when most men never sailed beyond the horizon. He stole enough treasure to reshape the English economy. He helped break the dominance of the greatest empire on earth. And he did it all from the deck of a ship barely 100 feet long, with nothing but wind in his sails and a grudge that would not die. The Spanish Empire never fully recovered from the blow the Armada's defeat dealt to its prestige. England went on to become the dominant naval power in the world, a trajectory that arguably began the day Francis Drake sailed the Golden Hind back into Plymouth Harbour with a king's ransom in the hold. The farmer's son from Devon had changed the course of history. If you found this story interesting, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, drop a like on this video, and let us know in the comments which historical figure you want us to cover next.